Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. I have another fantastic guest today. We have a theoretical physicist, Lawrence Krauss, with us. I will shortly read his bio, but first, how you doing, Lawrence?
I'm doing great. It's spring is here in Prince Edward Island, and went out for a walk and didn't see any snow in most of what I was walking on, so I'm in a good mood.
Wait a minute. You're in Prince Edward Island? You're in
You
Canada?
thought I was somewhere else, didn't you? I shouldn't have let anyone know. I shouldn't let. Yeah, I'm in Prince Edward Island. Yep.
Now, in preparing for our conversation, I just did a quick, cursory check of your bio. I didn't know that you went to Carleton University in Ottawa, that you were Canadian. Maybe you could tell us about this because, as
Oh,
you may
oh,
know, I'm in Montreal.
yeah. No, I know. Oh, you didn't know that. No, I grew up in Canada. I was born in the United States and moved to Canada when I was 3 months old, and grew up in Toronto.
Okay.
And then went to Carleton for a variety of reasons. Three reasons. One, because it was a physics program that I liked. Two, because it was a history program that I liked. And three, because I wanted to become bilingual. I actually tried to get in to McGill and also Université de Montréal, but because I was from Ontario, they were going to make me take a year of what's called CEGEP or something like that. And I'd
Right.
done 13 years of Ontario, and it was enough for me. Anyway, so I did not know I was an American when I grew up, and when I moved to the United States to go to graduate school at MIT, I was on a visa. I was on a visa the entire time I was at MIT, and I was married at the time. My wife was on the wife of a student visa, which is the worst visa you can possibly
Right.
have. She wasn't allowed any rights, couldn't work, couldn't do anything. And then when I moved to Harvard, I thought, well, I'd like to maybe try to get permanent residency in the United States. And I talked to Harvard lawyers, and they looked and they said, we think you're an American. And I said, how do I find out? They said, apply for a passport. And and then I contacted my lawyer, who, by the way, was my brother, who was a lawyer in Quebec. He actually
Okay.
was a lawyer and a professor at Université de Sherbrooke. And he looked into it and said, well, you have to do something else. You have to fill out a form. And the form is, why haven't you behaved like an American for the last 30 years or whatever? And the answer to every question was, I didn't know I was an American. So I filled out that
Wow.
form, got a passport, tore up my visa, my wife's visa, and yeah. So I moved back to Canada after 45 years in the United States, and
So now your permanent residence is in PEI.
yeah. I guess I haven't really let that cat out of the bag yet, but now it is.
It's out now. Are you happy
Yeah.
to be back
Oh
in the
yeah,
United
I'm
States?
I'm I'm thrilled to be away from the U.S. first of all, and it was getting too crazy. I lived in Oregon, which when I lived there was wonderful, and then it began to get nutty as I was
Yes,
leaving. That's not the reason at the time we moved,
right.
but no,
So
where I live is it's like the world was 40 years ago, as far as I'm concerned. Everyone talks to everybody, and people are lovely and kind, and of course it's beautiful. I live right near the ocean.
and I hope that since you're back in Canada, you now realize that you have to self-flagellate every morning with some land acknowledgements. I trust that you do that, Lawrence. Yes?
Well, yeah, in between my five prayers, yeah.
Very good. All right, let me just quickly read some of your key bios for the four people who don't know who you are. You are the president of the Origins Project Foundation. We can talk about that if you'd like after. Host of the Origins podcast. Somehow the invitation for me to come on that podcast must have been lost somewhere in the mail, but I'm sure that will be
I'm
rectified.
sure it'll be rectified.
Professor of physics for many, many years at many institutions, including Yale, Case Western, and most recently at Arizona State University, where you retired from in, I think, 2018. You are the author of, I think, 11 or 12 books. I'll very
Well,
quickly list them. 12?
yeah,
Are we at
12.
12? Okay. The Physics of Climate Change, the greatest story ever told so far, a universe from nothing, Quantum Man, Hiding in the Mirror, Atom, Beyond Star Trek, The Physics of Star Trek, Quintessence, Fear of Physics, and The Fifth Essence. Your latest book, which will drop in early May of this year, is The Edge of Knowledge. Incidentally, there you go. I haven't received my physical copy yet. I've received the e-copy, but not
The
the
e-copy.
physical one.
Oh, you got the e-copy. That's great. I haven't received the e-copy. I mean, I know I haven't received it yet.
No,
So
I
you.
think you may have sent it to me, where you might have even said something like, please don't share it with someone. I think it
Oh
was
yeah,
you.
that's right. I sent you. I sent
Yeah,
you a
you did.
PDF. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Not
I
the
did.
Kindle version. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Just for our guests who care about such things, you may be, unless I got my count wrong, the fourth physicist on my show. I had Lee Smolin. I'm sure you know
Hmm.
who that is. I
I
was
know Lee.
interested.
We were office mates at Yale a long, long time ago.
Well, I'm interested in his cosmological natural selection theory,
Yeah,
which we can
we'll
talk
talk about
about.
that if you want.
Brian Keating, who's also been on my show and I've been on his, and
Who was a
Alessandro.
student at Case when I was chair. But anyway, that's
Is that
okay.
true? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Who? Brian was? Not Lee.
Brian was,
Brian,
yeah.
yeah, okay. And then Alessandro Strumia, who faced some difficulties, and I invited him on my show to offer him a defense. And of course, there was the Particle for Justice people, which we could talk about if you'd like. Okay, so much.
By the way, just to be clear, I keep interrupting you, but that's what I do. I think I've been on the show before, so I may have been the first or second. We've done this once before, a whole bunch of years ago. I think around the time I was going to Montreal to give a public lecture of some sort. I know I've been sitting with you at the microphone. You can look back. Maybe you excised it from your memory, or maybe it never appeared.
I do remember that we met at a event where the president of Mexico was at, and we were both plenary speakers, and I think we might have sat at the same table and we just chatted for maybe 5 minutes. But yeah, I'll go back and check.
Yeah, I remember the background right behind you and all of that. So although it's a long forgotten podcast, but maybe it'll be resurrected somewhere. Anyway.
All right, so I'm going to start with the first line of your foreword, which I loved. I have to admit that I haven't read it yet, but I kind of quickly went through some.
Yeah, sure. I understand. You just got it. It's okay.
3 of the most important words in science are, quote, I don't know. Therein lies the beginning of enlightenment, because not knowing implies a universe of opportunities, the possibility of discovery and of surprise. My goodness, Dr. Krauss, you're arguing that epistemic humility is something that scientists should have? That can't be right. You must have been mistaken.
Well, when I was growing up, you were allowed to ask questions, and you were encouraged to explore. It was a quaint notion, and it seemed to work well for about 500 years in the scientific method, and we got pretty far with that. And both you and I share, as I know, a concern about the fact that that open inquiry, and the fact that you actually are not only free to say I don't know, but encouraged to recognize that you don't know all the details, that things remain to be worked out. That in fact, as I like to say, and it's true, that science can never prove anything to be true. It can only prove things to be false. Right. It can, you if something doesn't agree with the experiment, it's not false, but you don't know if the next experiment around the corner is going to cause you to refine your theories. But I think, I just wrote a piece. I don't know if it's going to appear anywhere. Based on that, I don't know, because I really think that is perhaps one of the greatest legacies of science that's missing in society. If we look at, from the right and the left, the people that are convinced of almost everything, whether it's there is no such thing as sex, or there are 2 sexes, or there is no such thing as climate change, or it's going to destroy the world. Everyone is certain of whatever they're saying, and with vaccines too. And the whole point of science is that you know what what survived the test of experiment, but the rest is open, and that's what makes it exciting. That's why young people, that's why I went into science at the end of the book, which you probably haven't gotten to. I point out that it was only when I was always interested in science, but I read a book by Richard Feynman when I was in high school. A teacher saw me being bored, in fact, and gave me this book, The Character of Physical Law. And it was only then that I kind of realized that it wasn't already all done, that it wasn't all done 200 years ago by dead white men or whatever, and that there were open questions. And to me, that was the invitation to discover. And as I said at the end of my book, I hope, I don't presume, but I hope that some young person will pick up this book and be so inspired. It was an invitation to join the club and try and answer some of those outstanding questions.
So there's the old Delphic maxim from the ancient Greeks, know thyself, right? And so let me link it to epistemic humility. So one of the reasons why, people often ask me, how, you're probably the most outspoken academic, that there is out there. How come you don't get canceled? And I mean, there are several reasons, I think, for that, knock on wood. But I think one of the reasons is that I'm very, I think, if I can speak of myself, I'm well calibrated about what I know and what I don't know. So that when I know something, good luck to you if you wish to debate me, because I'm going to walk with the swagger of someone who knows what they're talking about. On the other hand, there's a million things that I know very little, if anything, about. So that if you ask me a question about that, I'm sufficiently well modulated that I say, hey, Lawrence, that's a great question. I have no idea how to answer that. And because of that, I'm able to never get into trouble, because I can usually defend very well my positions. Why do so many academics lack that quality, if I can put it that way?
Well, I think first of all, it's not just that, it's great to diffuse people. When you admit you don't know something, suddenly people's defenses and their armor get drops. In fact,
And they trust you. They
and
trust
they
you because
trust you. As a brief aside, I'll never forget. One of the things we always tried to do when I was chair of a department, I was a professor, was getting our graduate students talking so they could give talks and get used to it. But when I did my PhD, there wasn't really that opportunity at MIT, and I got this job, which at the time was the dream job. It was the most prestigious job in the United States, called the Harvard Society of Fellows, and I was in Cambridge, and I'd been in Cambridge for 5 years up to that point, and no one knew who I was, and suddenly everyone knew who I was, but because I would suddenly have this job, and I really hadn't done anything. But I got invited to Princeton to give a talk, and I was terrified. I mean, because there were some people who are now my friends who were famous for tearing people apart when they gave seminars, and I went in at the talk, and I said, well, I want to talk about this stuff. It's very tentative, and I'd really like feedback, because and no one asked any questions. And afterwards, I spoke to David Gross, who's a Nobel Prize winning physicist and a friend of mine, but was famous for tearing people apart. And I said, what happened? He said, well, once you told us you wanted input, we all just shut up. But I think people are insecure. They're the ones who I think are afraid to say they don't know. And I find that more in sort of high school teachers and grade school teachers who feel like, who want to stick to the curriculum because they know the curriculum. And of course, that's the last thing you want to do with kids. But I think also, I think sometimes once you get credentials and people start asking you questions, you start answering, and again, Feynman talked about this one after he won the Nobel Prize. And so I've been well known over the years, and people start asking you questions about everything. And you want to please them. And at some point you want to respond and say, just give them something. Journalists all the time. And in fact, journalists always want scientists to say things with certainty. And you say, well, that's tentative, and they don't like to hear that.
That's
right. So I think there's a lot of external pressure more on people, and you have to be pretty self-confident, as you are undoubtedly, to admit you don't know. But it certainly diffuses, and I think that's my point. I think a lot of the hatred and anger and that's going on right now in popular culture, in the culture wars, really could be diffused if both sides would just say, okay, we don't know everything. Maybe you have something to say that I could learn from. And in fact, that was as you know, the point of John Stuart Mill, which I first learned from, I will say, from Christopher Hitchens, but it's John Stuart Mill who said the real point of free speech is not the freedom of the speaker to speak, but your freedom to learn that you might be wrong. And I think that's what's, and scientists love being wrong, right? Because that's the other aspect. It's a good training because if you're wrong, it means there's something exciting. If the standard model of particle physics, all of us, what's frustrating is it's too damn right. Every darn experiment that's going on is, keeps agreeing with it. And we're all looking for something that says, no, there's some chink in the armor.
Yeah,
because it's the way to go forward.
To your point about you going to Princeton, and you mentioned Feynman, I remember in his book, Surely You Must Be Joking, Mr. Feynman, he tells the story of when he first went to Princeton to speak in front of all these illustrious guys, many of whom were quite rough with speakers.
Einstein in particular,
but apparently, if I'm remembering my story right, and if you know the story, maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I think Einstein's, who hadn't said much during the talk, there was someone who was badgering Feynman, some famous other physicist, and he kind of, in a very gentle voice, said, "Don't you think we owe the young man the chance to finish his speech before we?" Do you remember that? And I thought, what? I love Einstein even more than I did before. After that kind of.
Well, that was nice of Einstein. Yeah, it's true. You probably don't know this, but my book Quantum Man is a scientific biography of Richard Feynman, perhaps the only one.
Did you ever, had he passed away before? I mean, I'm trying to.
No, I got to know him. In fact, I first met him in Canada, in Vancouver, as I said, I grew up in Canada. I went to school and did my undergraduate degree in Canada. Eventually, I was president of something called the Canadian Undergraduate Physics Association. The year before, I was vice president, and Feynman had come up to give a talk to the Undergraduate Physics Association in Vancouver, and the primary reason, and I know it's politically incorrect to say it now, but the primary reason was that the president of it was a very attractive woman who went down to, Feynman probably ignored most requests. He got many. She went down to Caltech and just showed up at his office and asked him if he would lecture, and he agreed to go up. So he ended up spending much of the weekend. We ended up spending much of the weekend together because of partly because I at the time I brought my girlfriend, and he was one of the reasons he hung around with me, I think.
Well,
but yeah. So and then later on, I talk about the story in one of my books. When I was at Harvard, I lectured at Caltech many times, and Feynman was in the audience, which was terrifying, by the way. And Feynman asked one question in public, and then after it was over, he came up and he wanted to ask me some more questions. So I was dying to remind him that the last time I'd met him, I'd been this lowly undergraduate, and people he wouldn't remember. And this pesky, obnoxious junior faculty member would not stop asking questions. And Feynman eventually gave up and left. And I thought, oh, it's okay. Next time I'll talk to him. And Feynman died shortly afterwards. So it's a regret that I have. And that's why that book was kind of a labor of love in a way.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I love about Feynman, but other famous academics, and I discussed this briefly in my forthcoming book. I have a book on the good life and happiness and so on, and I have a whole chapter that might resonate with you called life as a playground. So it's kind of to have a playful mindset, to be joyful, not to take yourself too seriously. And I argue that even under very serious circumstances, right, in the Holocaust, people were still finding a way to play. When I was in the Lebanese Civil War, I still needed to instantiate my desire to play as a young child. Well, science itself could be the ultimate form of play, right?
Oh, it is the ultimate form of play. In fact, for me, I don't know if I've written about it. I think I may. There was kind of a apocryphal moment when I was a graduate student. I was having a hard time, as many graduate students do, and I really wasn't enjoying what I was doing. And at some point, now a friend and later collaborator, a good friend, Shelley Glashow, won the Nobel Prize in Physics, spent the term at MIT, although I was going back and forth between Harvard and MIT anyway. And at some point, I used to do mathematical physics. And at some point, he looked at me and he said, there's a difference, but you got to know the difference between physics and formalism. And then, so we started to talk, and that really got me interested in physics. And then when I moved to Harvard, Shelley was just constantly, he was like a child. He was constantly playing. And that meant many things, by the way. We'd be joking at the blackboard, but also he'd be yelling and yelling, he'd say, you idiot, you're going to, and it was fine. And I'd say, you idiot back. Nowadays, I'm sure you'd be confronted by your dean and removed for saying that. But that kind of playfulness and willingness to joke and willingness to banter is a key part of science. And, it's also a part of science that people don't really appreciate. They think of Einstein as the prototypical scientist, someone working alone, in the room at night, discovering the secrets. Well, that's generally not the way science is done, including even theoretical physics. It's at the blackboard with people playing back and forth. Right. And it is play. And the reason almost all the scientists I know do what they do, they don't have this pretentious idea that they're going to save the world or uncover necessarily the secrets of reality. They do it because they enjoy it. Yeah, right. That's basically it.
But I mean, beyond science as a form of play, just having a playful mindset, not always taking yourself seriously. So I hear two types of feedback regarding my own personhood. Some say, my God, it's so lovely how you play around, you joke, you could be very serious professorial, but you could also be a joker. Others say, oh, that hurts your brand image. But and I so reject that, because I'm sufficiently secure in my personhood that I can be both professorial and a complete buffoon who could be funny and joking and not take myself seriously. But why is it, do you think, that most academics need to always have this air of profundity about them?
Well, because most academics are incredibly insecure and are terrified. Academics are generally cowards. It's a very safe area to be in, and if you keep your head low and no one bothers you, you can go through your whole life without ever having to confront anything more or less uncomfortable in one way or another. And I think that, but you're right. I mean, I've always been a joker, as you know, or people know, and many times as a result, people wouldn't take me seriously. Unfortunately, again, I didn't worry about it. And when you've done enough, and like Feynman was a joker, but everyone took Feynman seriously. So at some point, you're lucky enough that you can have that flexibility to joke. But nowadays, I think most faculty are afraid of joking for the other reason that you and I are quite aware of, is that jokes get you in trouble now.
Indeed, indeed.
You know, and it's such a shame because, yeah, humor, when that it infuses my books, not because it's because it's the only way I can do stuff. If it's not, it's, you know, humor gets me through the day, and it should get all of us through the day. You're absolutely right. It's the key to happiness.
I wanna drill down the contents of your book in a second, but since you were talking about different aspects of your career, you know, writing books as a professor, of the many different hats, popularizer of science, you know, media person, writing trade books, academic books, professor, is there one hat that you uniquely prefer, and if so, why?
No, absolutely not. And you know, I often have thought to myself, you know, if I could just do one thing, you know, I see a lot of my colleagues who just are, you know, tunnel vision and they're working regularly, and I just can't. To me, it's, first of all, I do what I enjoy, and also each thing for me is a seed. It's going to lead places I don't know. It's happened in my physics career. It's happened in my writing career. It's taken me to places and do things I never would have imagined. So I like to plant lots of seeds and see where which ones are going to bloom and which ones aren't, because I don't know. Often something I think is really important turns out to be not important, and something I thought was not important turns out to be very important. And but also I think, you know, I'm easily distracted. But the other thing is I just don't know which of the things I do is more useful, and so it's comfortable for me to jump around. I enjoy, at different times I enjoy each of them, and I've been fortunate because I didn't plan a career like I have. I mean, so I'm very fortunate to have had many different hats, but I also think I couldn't have functioned without them. I think, you know, people say, does your popular writing get in the way of your research? When I was, you know, actively doing research, and sure, at some level it does, but other times it's inspired it. And so I think it's, you know, I'll give you an example. Another friend and colleague and someone I revered, although he's passed away now, is Steven Weinberg, who was one of the greatest theoretical physicists of the last part of the last century. And he was a mentor and friend, and I took many courses from him too earlier on. But he used to have the TV on when he did physics, because he found the distraction helped him. Now I can't do that. I couldn't do that, but I think being able to go away from one thing and do another energizes me. And also, when I was a kid, I never wanted to specialize. I don't know if you're that way. I mean, I wanted to do lots of different things. In fact, I guess PEI is one of the secrets I'll unveil on this, but I'm going back now to write a book that I began. I took a year off school when I was 19 in college, and worked on a Canadian history book. And I'm going to go back now. I have thousands of pages. I spent a year at the archives with restricted material that hadn't people seen, and I owe it to my teacher back then. But my next book's going to be a Canadian history book. So
well, what a great segue, because as you were saying about, I love wearing different hats, I was going to segue into the fact that, forgive me for plugging my forthcoming book on happiness. I have a chapter on variety seeking, and I talk about many types of variety seeking, you know, sexual variety seeking, food variety seeking, and then of course, of relevance to both of us as academics, intellectual variety seeking. And I argue that I am the ultimate, I mean, to a fault, because, you know, in academia, they want you to stay in your lane, specialize in one thing, you know, and I've published in economics and consumer psychology and bibliometrics and medicine and politics, because I don't care. I just want to go wherever that's an interesting problem. Hey, let's work on it, Lawrence. And now, so do you think that there could ever be a day? I mean, universities always state from this side of their mouth that they're all about interdisciplinarity, but all of the reward mechanisms from this side of the mouth don't support interdisciplinarity. Do you ever see these two, you know, being consistent with each other, so that we can actually truly reward those who are broad thinkers?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, I don't know about rewards, but I also think it takes all types. It's 1,000 flowers bloom, or whatever you want to call it. So some people who work on one thing their whole life, that's exactly what they should be doing. And some of them spent 20 years doing it. I think that's the real thing. The real lesson is that there's no stereotype that of a scientist or an academic that's really appropriate. Some academics like you and I'm, I think in many ways that way, need to work on many different things. I love to, you know, throughout my career, I've worked on many different areas of physics because, I get to learn something new. I come in and I make a hit and I leave. Now there's some, and as you point out, there's some disadvantages, because you write what may be an important paper, but then people are writing for 10 years and then people, you've left the field. But that's okay. I think it's difficult for universities that are defined along 19th century disciplines
Yeah.
to do that. And frankly, one of the reasons I moved, one of the arguments the president of ASU gave me, the lip service he paid that made me move, was he was creating a university that wasn't based on 19th century departments. So different fields were coming together, and I was at a school of Earth and Space Exploration that also had physics, but there were schools that were bringing together different departments. And so it was an attempt to do it. In the end, of course, because disciplinarity is what ultimately produces reference letters and ultimately produces promotions, that it's very difficult to get around that. And again, in physics, early on, I haven't had that problem for years, but very early, I decided I was a particle physicist, but I got interested in cosmology in the early 1980s because it seemed to be the area where we could learn things. Accelerators weren't coming up with new stuff necessarily, and the universe was an experiment. But the astronomers, viewed me or as a physicist, and the physicists might be viewing me as an astronomer, and it's a little difficult if you're at that cross-disciplinary border. Now, what happened is that cross-disciplinary border became the exciting area, and that sort of disappeared. But it can be very difficult, and I don't know a solution except the way it used to be. And it's not so much anymore because there's so many rules and regulations, especially I've even learned in Canada more than in the States because things are unionized and all sorts of stuff. But it used to be that people could get tenure who were both difficult to deal with and also may not have produced this stuff. There's a very famous, you mind if I tell you an anecdote about Dirac, who was one of the most revered and one of the best, next to Einstein, was one of the greatest physicists of that part of the 20th century. Developed quantum mechanics and has, as Feynman envied, had an equation named after him, the Dirac equation. But Dirac was a notably a laconic isn't even the right word. He never spoke. In fact, it turns out his father, when he was growing up, required him to speak in French at the dinner table, and so he barely spoke at all. So at one point he was a student, and he'd been a student in Cambridge, I think, and Rutherford, I think, was his supervisor, maybe not, but Rutherford. He went to the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen and went there as a postdoc, and Bohr wrote back to England and said, "What is this guy? Who did you? This guy doesn't talk to anyone. He doesn't do it. He hasn't written anything. Why did you force him on it?" So. Rutherford told him a joke, which I'll tell you, which I like. He said the guy goes into to buy a parrot, and he's a parrot, and it's a beautiful parrot there, and they say, "How much is this parrot?" He goes, "Oh, $500. And he looks in this corner and he sees this ragged parrot, and really ugly, and he goes, "How much is that?" And it goes, "Oh, that parrot, it's it's $500,000. What?" And he says, "Well, how many words does this parrot speak? This pretty one?" He speaks 50. How many words does that one speak? Well, he doesn't speak anything. And he goes, "Well, why are you charging so much for this one and so little for that one? This one is pretty and it speaks, and that one just sits there." And the guy goes, "That one thinks." and that's what he told him. And it turned out Dirac was thinking. And so it's a long roundabout answer to your question, but it was easier, I think, in the old days for people who did things off the beaten path, but somehow were brilliant, and you could tell from talking to them every now and then or seeing what they did, and they were able to remain in the system. It's harder now, and I've been on both sides of that. I was a department chair for 15 years almost, and I remember trying to recruit a few people who were very difficult to get along with. And I remember one and he's now done very well elsewhere, but they come, what it's like. You have this visiting faculty member, they come in, they try to impress everyone around them. And if they insult some people, they're not going to get the job. And that's exactly what he did. And I tried to say, well, look, he may be a little idiosyncratic, but he's worth it. But it's hard to convince, because academics are largely herd-like in mentality.
Oh yes.
And
I call
largely
them
cowards.
I call them the invertebrate castrati class. So
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah, it's a good one. It is, and look, they're good at what they do, but it is a very safe job that people who are often afraid of either controversy or living in the real world take.
Yeah.
And on my experience, and this isn't just recent, I've always recognized, I think that most academics are very timid, shy, and often the cowardly. And we're seeing, we're seeing it now as there's various controversies. I think most academics would just rather keep and I understand it, keep your head below the radar and just do what you're interested in. And that's what they want to do.
So do you think, so before I want to build on what you just said, but just to finish off on interdisciplinarity, one of the concepts that I love the most, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is the concept that E.O. Wilson kind of reintroduced into the lexicon in the late 90s, Concilience, right? And I use that concept throughout all of my work, right? The idea being that you can't have consilience in the behavioral sciences without using evolutionary theory as the organizing framework. And so it's almost impossible to be interdisciplinarian without having a synthetic mind that seeks to draw links between disparate areas. Is this something that we can teach our graduate students, or is it that you're either born a synthetic thinker or you're not?
Well, it's hard to know. I have, as someone who taught for 40 years, I'm very wary of teaching. I've often wondered if I've ever really taught. I motivate, and then I think people teach themselves to the large, or don't teach themselves, one or the other. I think we can encourage, by example, the usefulness with examples of people picking knowledge from one area and applying it to another, or looking at problems outside their own area. I think we can teach that by example. But again, I think it's largely a personality trait as well. And I think, I mean, that's to make another segue to books, which is, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I write books, and the kind of books I've written. It's very easy to write the same book over and over again, and I have a lot of my colleagues, friends who have done that. But I try each time I write a book to pick, something I know something about, but something that will stretch me into an area I don't know, partly because there are two ways to learn things that you'd like to learn, at least ways that I know. Maybe people who are more disciplined can do it another way. One is to teach it.
Yeah.
To choose to teach something that you don't really know very well. It's the only way you really learn it. But the other way for me is to write a book about it, because, I can be flippant and talk to you about this or that, but when you put it down on paper, at least for me, there's a whole different level of seriousness, and you have to kind of understand it. And therefore it's a way for me to have been able to learn about, other areas. This book, it's got 5 parts: time, space, matter, but the last 2 are life and consciousness. And people may say, how dare you, physicists, talk about that. And I actually have an excerpt from the life chapter coming out, which points out that actually origins of life issues were really first, almost everyone significant in that field was a physicist at the beginning. Right. And Schrodinger wrote a book called What is Life, which was an incredibly influential book. But I think the kind of questions you ask as a scientist should allow you to look at those things. And for me, the last chapter, which was consciousness, was the biggest challenge. It's something I wanted to learn more about, very suspicious of most things that were said about it. And I came away more suspicious, in fact. But it gives you the discipline to say, well, look, if I'm going to write something that's going to be in print, I better at least kind of understand it. And that's also, I don't know if you found this also, it's also true when I've been writing about physics. There are ideas that I thought I understood really well, that when I wrote down in a popular book, not just the mathematics, but when I wrote down a popular book, I realized I didn't understand them. And it took a long time for me to do that. And almost every book I write, even if even the physics parts of this book, cause me to force myself to understand something in a new way, or more detailed, or learn something that I didn't know before.
So sorry, go ahead. Finish your
point.
No,
I mean, I'm just going to say the one thing we really need to do, I'm not sure, is teach people to be, interdisciplinary as much as to be lifelong learners. I think that's the main point.
Indeed. So, I mean, you set up the topic for your latest book really nicely. You've got 5 key concepts: time, space, matter, life, consciousness, as you said. And at the start of each of these chapters, you have, I don't know, 4 or 5 questions that you tackle. What was the process for you generating first the 5 key? Why is it 5, not 6, not 4? And then how did you generate each of the questions within each of those 5 topics?
That's a really good That's a great question. And the
Thank you.
answer is, I mean, I knew I was going to write a book about what we knew we didn't know. And in fact, the book in England is called The Known Unknowns, and which comes from a quote from Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah,
And my
right.
American publishers decided that that would be too alienating if I had a quote from Donald Rumsfeld. Even though it's a great quote, and I'm not a fan of Donald Rumsfeld in any way, but he said something really intelligent, and so you got to give it to him. But so
It was during a
basically,
press conference, right? During the one of the
yeah,
war.
press conference talking about their invasion of Iraq,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and which I was an opponent of and still am. But I tried to ask myself, what are the key outstanding mysteries that I know about as a scientist, or things that I'd like to know about. And then time, space, and matter really define the physical universe for us. And then it was really a matter of thinking about what are the things, and I had to sit down and spend a lot of time. What are the key questions that people may have, not just scientists, but the public? And how do they relate to things at the forefront of science? Because, it's like when I wrote a book called The Physics of Star Trek. That was a hook, right? I mean, Star Trek's fun, and I enjoyed it, and it was a great opportunity. But it was really a hook to get people to learn about the real universe, because the real universe is more interesting than Star Trek universe. So the question, what I really want to do is bring people up to date to the forefront of science. It's not just about, hey, we don't know this, we don't know that. It's a hook to try and say, well, you really can't understand what we don't understand until you get some sense of what we do. And so I tried to think of questions that would naturally allow me to go to those areas where I knew forefront science was at a precipice, where I go to meetings and people disagree because they don't understand, or there are questions we've known for a long time that we don't understand, like what's the energy of empty space. So really, I tried to think of questions that were not just ones that would resonate with the public, which is important because you got to get people to pick it up and say, gee, I've asked that question.
Sure.
But also ones that have a strong relationship to what's really going on in the field. So it was that balance that I tried to make.
Very interesting. About 2 months ago, we were vacationing in Florida, my children, my wife and I. They're young, my children, 14 and 11. And at one point, what? Say again?
I discovered since I moved back here, everyone goes to Florida in the winter. Anyway, go on.
We got into this really beautiful philosophical conversation about what exactly kind of the general topic of your book, what is knowable, what is not. And at one point, my 11-year-old son asked, well, will we ever have the capacity to know what was at starting point, the start of the universe? And so then I started explaining, well, some of the things that we now know, let's say in physics or in astrophysics, stem from methodological revolutions, right? More powerful telescope that allows us to see more. And then, so I'm giving that as a background. And as I was preparing for our chat, I thought, well, I studied previously in my previous life, mathematics and computer science, pure mathematics. And so, of course, there you got Gödel's incompleteness theorem that talks about what can you prove, what can't you prove. In complexity theory in computer science, you have NP hard problems and NP what is the other one, NP hard and NP complete problems and so on, which again is a taxonomy of things that you could solve in polynomial. So is there a similar metric that we can use in physics that allows us to say, based on these axioms, this question can never be solved?
No, and I think that's a really wonderful thing about physics and most of empirical science is you don't know till you try. And in fact, I remember I was talking to Martin Rees about this because he's been interested in what's knowable. And people ask, are there limitations to what we'll ever know? And this book is not about that at all. It's not about what's not knowable. It's about what we know we don't know. And we may never know. But we don't know until we try. There are problems that are hard and I'm sure will not be solved that I mentioned here this century. There are other ones that we may solve tomorrow. And so I'm always amazed when people say science will never understand love. Say love. And I always think about that and I say, well, in order for you to say that, you must understand it, because how do you know we'll never understand it if you don't understand? And so the only way is to keep trying. And so far, we've not come up against any brick wall. We come up against brick walls, we can go around them and solve the problem. So I see no evidence. People have asked me, look, we have brains, we have mathematics, but we have a certain number of neurons. We have, are there fundamental limitations in what we can know about nature? And I think the answer is, again, not known. And I think the only way to find out is to try, because physics isn't axiomatic. We move forward by discoveries about nature that we hadn't expected, that move. So it's not as if you locked Einstein and Dirac and whatever into a room without any access to what was going on in the world around them, they wouldn't have come up with relativity or quantum mechanics. They were driven to it by experiments.
Right.
And so it's different than mathematics in that sense. And therefore, I think we're only limited ultimately by what we can measure and our willingness to go out and look for new ways to explore the universe. And that's why I'm so dismayed sometimes when people think that, well, we shouldn't build a new accelerator, we shouldn't build new telescopes, because, what does it have to do with a better toaster, a faster car, or even solving poverty? And the first, I think if we are that impoverished as a society that we can't ask these fundamental questions, then it's real impoverishment. And and if it took a significant fraction of the gross national product to answer any of these questions, I'd say, yeah, let's think about it. But even the superconducting super collider, which was a big accelerator we were building in Texas, which would have preceded the Large Hadron Collider and done more and much earlier, was canceled because it cost at that point about $4 billion and was going to cost about $10 billion. And there were a lot of political reasons for canceling it. But let's face it, it was going to cost about $10 billion over 10 to 20 years. Okay. And, $10 billion used to seem like a lot of money, right? But now but even then, even that, $1 billion a year, that's the price of an aircraft carrier or something like it. And so it's not an economic question, but it's also, I think, again, it comes to what, you do something, your area is applied and useful. What I do, you could say isn't useful in that sense. And I'm proud of it. No, but I'm proud of it because people say, well, what use is it to understand the first moments of the universe, or whether the universe is infinite, or whether you go back in time, or maybe people are interested in that for the stock market or some other reason. But I always say, well, it amazes me. Science has the unfortunate characteristic that it also produces remarkable technology. And I mean that facetiously, of course, but people equate science to technology. So unless you're actually building something better, you forget that what's amazing about science, and the best thing about science is the ideas, is the change of our picture of our place in the cosmos. And I always say, people never ask, what's the use of a Mozart symphony or a Picasso painting? They don't, because it doesn't have technology associated with it. But it does exactly the same thing. It changes our picture of ourselves and our appreciation of who we are and and our place in the world. And we should never stop asking these questions, because that culturally is what keeps culture worth sustaining.
But incidentally, although I appreciate your kind words about being in an applied field, and I think that's great, I am an epistemological purist in that I come from pure mathematics, right?
Yeah, sure.
Right now, Fermat's many of his theories sat collecting dust for hundreds of years and only found an application 300 plus years later, now with the advent of cryptography. So it's very dangerous to use the criterion of, is there a direct application? How about you just do it to elevate the human spirit, and then we'll worry about the rest.
Yeah, and that's the point. And so I'm not saying that nothing I do will ever have an application. I'll bet you a lot of money that it probably won't. But who knows? But that's not the reason I do it. And that's not the reason to do it, as you point out. I think, and you're absolutely right, you never know not only where a good idea is going to come from, but where an application is going to come from. And so we owe it, if we're interested in applications, if we're interested in improving the human condition, and that includes technologically, food, wealth, safety, all the rest, we owe it to ourselves to explore everything. Right. I remember once, I think we were testifying before Congress, and there was a big effort, and it was someone who was the head of a major, I think it was a National Academy study, but and he was the head of a major actually military industrial complex thing. But anyway, he ran this study, and I think it was called the Rising Tide or something. But ultimately, it demonstrated that 50% of the gross national product of the United States was based on curiosity-driven fundamental research a decade, or not a decade, a generation earlier. If
Wow.
we'd wanted to build faster computers in the 1940s, we would have had wheels and better faster wheels and gadget. But then they invented the transistor, and that changed it. It's always been that way. Curiosity-driven research is useful because it enhances the condition, but ultimately it's useful because it produces the things that are going to drive the wealth and health of a society a generation down the road.
Yeah, beautiful. Of all of the questions that you pose in your 5 sections, if we were to take all those questions, submit them to 10,000 people to rate them on their interest score, whatever metric, which one do you think is the one that generates the greatest amount of, excitement, curiosity from people? Even though we haven't done that experiment, can you venture
Well, I
again?
think there are a few areas, and I can judge it from some of the writing I've done.
Okay.
Time itself is something that people are fascinated by, and the idea of time travel. I mean, the notion, we all recognize this what seems like a tragic inevitability that we move forward in time until the day of our death, and that seems, we confront that in many ways on a daily basis, but certainly throughout our lives. And the notion of time as this inexorable thing that moves forward is something that I think both depresses people and excites them in a different way. So time travel, whether we can go back in time, is always, and certainly in science fiction, which I've written about, it's always the most interesting topic. But another topic I ultimately think, which really resonates with people, and that's one of the reasons why I included the chapter in life, is not only what is the origin of life on Earth, but the question we all ultimately ask, which is, are we alone in the universe? I think everyone asks that, and the fact that we can even say anything about that now, are making some progress. Although I've written recently an article pointing out that some of it is overstated. That is a question I think all of us, you can't help but look out at the night sky and ask that question, and thankfully we can still ask the question, because remember, Giordano Bruno in the, I forget whether it was the 15th century, asked that question, said all the stars are like stars like our own, and they have planets around them in civilization. He got burned at the stake for asking that question. I told later that he got burned at the stake because he was a pretty disagreeable character too. But I think that question, perhaps, questions about time, and of course everyone wants to know about the universe. How did it begin? Is it infinite? Those kind of questions, which I put in there, are big questions, but I think our origins are another. And the last one, the reason consciousness is there, not just because it's probably the biggest mystery outstanding in science in many ways, but because we all want to get in someone else's mind. Well, I wonder when, I'm colorblind, but I still see red every now and then. When you see red, is it the same? And when my dog looks at me, I have 2 dogs sitting here right with me right now, and when they look at me,
I heard their
what are they
feet
thinking?
earlier.
Yeah, the feet, one of them is a little, yeah, she's old. She's been wandering around. I was going to let her out because I thought you might hear her. But, when I look in their eyes, what are they thinking? So this notion that we are trapped in our own consciousness is tragic and exciting at the same time. And I think all of us would like to understand who is the me behind me. Right. Maybe you write about it more in recent stuff. So those are a series of questions. And one of the reasons I've equivocated somewhat in my answer to you is everyone always asks me on so many different topics, what's the most X, or what's your favorite Y? And it just psychologically, I don't think that way. I don't think hierarchically. Lots of things interest me, and I try not to. I mean, and they can all be really equally interesting. And I often don't think of which is more interesting. But based on my experience, and I've spent a lot of time with the public, as you know, I think the physics question of time is perhaps one of the most important. The biological question of, are we alone, and what does it mean to be me, are the other two, I think. That's why I press the limit.
No, I got you. Do you think that there's something that, I mean, not that makes physics impenetrable, but the fact that so much of our folk physics knowledge, breaks down when you incorporate, theories that even, I think I'm more educated than most people. And whenever I watch one of those popular science physics shows, I'm like, this sounds like a lot of bullshit to me, right? Right? I mean, and I'm not like the dumbest guy in the world.
Yeah.
And so could it be that part of the reason why physics has a unique mystique and allure is precisely because our folk psychology fails us so often when we think about these grand issues?
Part of it is that. I think part of it has been manufactured by the physics community, to tell you the truth. Well, partly for fundraising. I mean, there's a historical and sociological arguments that, the big science, which was created with the Manhattan Project, didn't exist before, right? And it used to be nothing special about scientists, but suddenly they had the secret to the atomic bomb, and it elevated them to a priesthood that was kind of different. And preserving that priesthood is something that I think is kind of attractive. Hey, we know something you could never understand. Is attractive at some level. I think the other aspect is that it's been just so darn successful.
Right.
So that the questions that physicists asked when Newton was asking those questions, or even when Maxwell and Faraday were developing the laws of electromagnetism, were directly related to human experience. But as physics became so successful, the key questions moved away from human experience and became farther and farther and farther from human experience. And that's wonderful, because it means we're understanding the universe on scales that we never imagined we'd understand. And how amazing is it that we can understand go back to the first second of the universe when we've never even left our solar system. But at the same time, the negative feature is that those questions have become so far removed from what anyone is used to that even physicists have a hard time conceptualizing those questions. Right. And quantum mechanics, and I spend a fair amount of time in one of the chapters talking about quantum mechanics, because I think there's so much garbage written about it. I know people, and I won't mention names, who write books on quantum mechanics, many worlds, because it sounds good and it sounds awe-inspiring. But in fact, I think it's, as I point out in the book, and I learned it from a much smarter man than me, a colleague of mine named Sidney Coleman, who was at Harvard. It's the wrong way to think about it. People talk about the interpretation of quantum mechanics with all these weird things. And as he pointed out, we should be talking about the interpretation of classical mechanics. Quantum mechanics is the real world. Classical mechanics is this imaginary overlayer. And of course, whenever you try and explain the fundamental world in terms of some kludge, you're going to come up with things that sound crazy, like many worlds and all that stuff. But that just sounds good. But the real quantum world is strange, and indeed, and we can't intuit it because we are classical beings. And so I think the fact that even scientists, our intuition generally breaks down until we work very hard in these areas, means that we just, as I say, just trust the mathematics because the mathematics works.
Well, actually,
so anyway, I think that we're victims of our own success in that sense in physics. And that's why biology is more immediate. Yeah. And I'll segue to something else. Me and a physicist, a Nobel Prize winning physicist named Leon Lederman, who was a wonderful joker, by the way. He worked very hard in Chicago, and we've worked other places to try and change the way we teach science in high school. We tend to teach biology first, then chemistry, and then physics. And that's exactly the wrong way. But the reason is that biology seems more accessible, frogs and that sort of thing. But of course, that means you have to take things on faith in biology. You take things on faith that chemistry would explain to you. You take chemistry and you don't know what energy is. So ultimately, the logical way to do it is take physics, and then, which is the basis of chemistry, which is the basis of biology. But the problem is that physics, essentially being more mathematical, is more remote. So we have that problem in teaching, and it's a really unfortunate thing, because kids think of science as things you take on faith or memorize instead of figuring it out. And that's a real misconception about science.
Well, so I want to speak to that point in a second by bringing in Auguste Comte and his hierarchy of sciences in a second. Okay. But before I do that, to your point about, studying things at the cosmological level, Richard Dawkins, as you know, and I saw that earlier, you retweeted him because he had said something nicely about your latest book, talks about middle world, right? The idea that our brains have evolved to study things at the scale that our brain interacts with the world in, right? Mm-hmm. So things at the nano level, our folk psychology breaks down. Things at the cosmological level, our folk psychology breaks down. Middle world is where we navigate.
Yeah, and in fact, if you ever see them, they made a movie. Richard and I have done a lot of lectures around the world, as you probably know, and they made a movie about it called The Unbelievers. And I remember it was the Sydney Opera House we were talking, and he was saying it's amazing. I mean, people ask this question: what on earth, how did evolution get people who could understand quantum mechanics? So what evolutionary imperative is there to do it? And clearly there isn't. There's an evolutionary imperative to understand the middle world, as you're talking about, because it helps you survive. But some unintended consequence is, and he said, it's amazing that that we understand quantum mechanics, or at least that anyone does, or relativity, or even time, even long time. The big problem of evolution is none of us can appreciate 10,000 generations, much less 100 generations. And so to see the slowness of evolution is so non-intuitive. It is an amazing accident of evolution and intelligence that this byproduct of intelligence and came out. And it may be in the far future, if there are historians around, or maybe aliens from another planet who come to see the remains of what existed on our planet once. They may say, well, that evolution, that was an evolutionary byproduct, but it was a maladaptation. It's right. A pity that they got it, because it meant
well, you're really speaking my language now. Exaptation, adaptations, maladaptation. So you're right up in my wheelhouse. Okay, let me link it to Auguste Comte. So Auguste Comte, for those of you who don't know, argue that there's a hierarchy of sciences, and as you move up, you get to sociology at the top of the hierarchy. Now,
I mean, he was the bottom, but anyway.
No, but to his point, I think, one of the points that he was making is that it's, quote, a lot easier to study. He didn't. I'm using my words now, not his. To study the molecular structure of a particular, whatever. It seems to be more deterministic than to try to understand. If, let's say, I study evolutionary psychology and consumer psychology, to study the most complex organ in the universe, known as the human brain. And now let me try to find a way to either through psychology or biology or mathematical modeling to model consumer choice. Epistemologically seems a lot more difficult to do.
Oh, it is.
So in that sense, I think his hierarchy makes sense. What are your thoughts?
It does. And I often say this, and I think I've said on stage with Richard, with other biologists, and people think I'm joking because they laugh. And I say, I do physics because it's easy. I don't, neurobiology is hard, and psychology is hard, and sociology is hard, and in the sense that it's made much less progress because it's so much harder. Physics, you have systems that you can isolate and study, and of course, everyone thinks physics is impenetrably hard, and mathematically it's demanding, and as you say, conceptually, because we're so far removed from everyday experience, it's demanding. But as a science, in some ways, it's so much easier, and that's why it's been so much successful. If the other fields were as easy, we'd be as far into our understanding of consciousness as we are to our understanding of the nature of fundamental particles.
And I think, to the credit of the natural sciences and less so to the social sciences, I'm bringing back now the concept of Concilience. There aren't chemists who are pro-periodic table and chemists who are anti-periodic table. So you can have core knowledge that we can tick off as it's set. Now, of course, with the epistemic humility that everything is provisionally true, but right? So we can all agree that gravity exists, and here are some fundamental truths about gravity. Whereas in the social sciences, the bifurcation of our disagreement could start at the most basic point. Does biology matter in explaining human behavior? A bunch of people say yes, a lot more people say no, and we're already off into different ecosystems of knowledge, and we could never join again together. So that's really the secret, I think, of the success of the natural sciences. You have organized frameworks of trees of knowledge where we could hang our hats on those trees of knowledge. We don't have such a thing in social science.
Yeah, we have the success of experiments and knowledge based on knowledge. And I would say, a lot of people think I'm an anti-philosophy because of jokes I've made. My book, A Universe from Nothing, I argued at the beginning that I knew theologians and philosophers would disagree with what I said because they're experts at nothing. But and they took it seriously, unfortunately. But anyway, but my point is, and one of the reasons people think I'm anti-philosophy is that I make the true statement that philosophy isn't important in physics anymore. In the sense, empirically, and I'm not talking about some qualitative value judgment. I think philosophy is fascinating, but the question is do physicists who are functioning as physicists, are they driven by questions that philosophers are asking? And they're not.
Right.
That's because the field has progressed so far. But they used to be. It used to be called natural philosophy for a reason. And I point out in my book, in the last chapter, that I think it's quite telling that when I talk about consciousness, I'm quoting and talking about philosophers as much as I am neurobiology. I'm talking about Dan Dennett and Patricia Churchland and other people, all sorts of people, Noam Chomsky, and in a sense, and I think that's telling. It's not a pejorative statement. It says that when you're in a nascent part of science, philosophy is useful because what philosophy helps you do is critically frame questions.
Yeah.
And then get a start. And in consciousness, we don't even have the good questions. We don't know what the good questions are. The difference is in physics, we know what the good questions are.
Right.
And we don't need the philosophers anymore. And there are philosophers of science who do interesting work, but they're not read by the physicists. And as I like to say, most physicists can't spell philosophy. But that's not a value judgment. It's a fact. And I think and when you come to sociology and more those, I don't think of sociology as a science at this point, but let's say it's would be science. When you come to those areas, philosophy is as important as anything else because you don't yet know what the good questions are. For example, how do you ascertain whether biology is a central feature of consumer
behavior,
choice, and that those kind of questions. So I think that's what you can see, and I make that statement again, not pejoratively, at the end, that a lot of the good work, interesting work on the nature of consciousness is coming from philosophers because we really don't even have a good definition of consciousness, and philosophers are trying to ask the questions that lead us to what a good definition is.
So your sort of slightly pejorative statement about sociology is really relevant in terms of a segue, because I'm going to try to defend. I'm not a sociologist, so I don't have a dog in the fight, but I think sociology is failing as a science, not because epistemologically it isn't a science, right? Because you could ask very important questions as a sociologist and then apply the tools of the scientific method in exactly as rigorous a way as any other quote scientist. The problem with sociology, which is going to lead us down the wokeism stuff, is that there are some disciplines that are inherently more likely to be parasitized by bullshit, or what I call in the parasitic mind, idea pathogens, right? Whereas you would have thought until recently, although I warned against it, if I can say I told you so, you would have thought that the natural sciences have an inoculation against bullshit, but we're finding out that physicists and chemists and biologists are just as prone to be parasitized by woke ideas as the rest of us. What are your thoughts?
I'm not sure just as likely, but they are. And we're seeing it. I think I don't know, I didn't in this book, but I know I've written somewhere that when I taught at Yale, science was on this thing called Science Hill, and which was appropriate, it seemed. But it was also interesting because most of the Yale students never set foot on Science Hill until we forced them to take one science course. But we used to laugh because when I was at Yale, that was the heart of deconstructionism, which is postmodernist. That's where and we used to laugh and say, "Look at these! Oh my God!" And of course, look
where we are now.
Yeah, there, but for the grace of God, as they say. But and so I think you're right about that. But I think that part of my reaction, by the way, to sociology is, I took a sociology course. My brother did a degree in sociology, and one of the first classes I took at university, I had to take a general course with sociology. And I was reading Durkheim and I became fascinated. I thought, hey, maybe I can use the tools of physics and these can be directly applied, and I can be this great sociologist, because the words sound the same. And that's when I first learned, it took me a while, that you have to be very careful with analogies. That you can talk about entropy or this or that, but if you push it beyond the domain of its validity, which a lot of people were doing in sociology, you can't treat a human system like you can a group of atoms in the same way. And the concepts may be enlightening, but you got to be really wary of pretending you're being more scientific than you are. And that, of course, is an invitation, not just to wokeism, but anything else. It's an invitation to the ridiculousness of the right, or the misuse of genetics early on, and all of that. It's an invitation when you when you think you're being more scientific, you are. And how do we know that? Because you don't ask yourself questions, and you're not subjected to critical thinking on other people. So it's taken for granted that what you're saying is true, which is the worst possible thing that can happen in any area, in my mind, of human activity. It's certainly an anathema to science, and it's the source of dogma and religion, and unfortunately secular religion, and in many ways now what you and I might call wokeism.
And to our earlier point, where we were talking about the cowardice and the kind of the meekness of academics, I'm going to propose something, and then you give me your thoughts. So I think one of the reasons why many of these woke idea pathogens have proliferated in academia is because is your dog okay?
Yeah, I'm gonna take my dog and let him out, because she looks like she might want to do something.
Okay, go ahead, and then I'll continue. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, come here, Tasha. No, Levi's okay. Hold on. Oh, sorry. This is she might as well be a star. She's 16.
Oh, look at that.
She's 16, but sometimes I don't know what she's up to, so I'm gonna let her go.
First time ever on the Saad Truth, a break for a dog.
Yeah, dog with your Nancy. I'm bringing Tasha down because she's going back and forth. Okay. Can you take her out? Can you hear me? Okay. Really, but I want you might as well. You might as well be a star of this show. Okay, our first time, two dog.
Oh, look at that double dog appearance.
Yeah, double dog. There you go. This is the one who was sitting listening.
Okay. Well, I'm a huge dog person, so I'm happy to take a break for dogs.
Yeah, me too. I much prefer dogs to people myself.
So do I. So do I.
Okay, well, I'm back. The dogs are out, and now, yeah. I think the dogs didn't mind. No, Levi doesn't mind listening about physics, but he hates sociology, so he wanted.
So what I was saying is, do you think that one of the reasons why many of these idea pathogens that were spawned on university campuses and then proliferated widely all the way to the natural sciences precisely comes from the fact that academics are cowardly, so that the personhoods that would have been required to stand up and say, wait a minute, this is utter bullshit, most academics don't have that capacity, and so those bad ideas then end up spreading without any built-in resistance against them?
Well, I think you have to qualify that. Most scientists, most academics, but I'll say scientists because the people I interact with the most, you go into work trying to prove your colleagues wrong, okay? Because that's how you get well known, right? So the whole point of going in, that's why people talk about this club of scientists and evolutionists who somehow have this secret handshake. If you could prove evolution was wrong, you'd love to do it, because then you'd be famous. But so you are trying to, in some sense, critique others. But I think it comes down to more a fear of raising of critiquing ideas that may not that may gain attention, that may gain you unwanted attention.
Right.
And so I think you want the attention of your colleagues in certain ways to they want the attention on you and your ideas. But you don't want to say things that brings attention for people you want to hide from or avoid from. And I think that, in my mind, that's the characteristic of most academics, I would say, is trying to avoid the parts of the things they don't want to be subject to. And it's real. And look, it is terrifying. It isn't, well, maybe terrifying is an overstatement, but if you're an academic and you're in your little niche and talking to people, that's fine. It is for many people terrifying to step outside that and suddenly being in an environment where you're not kind of in control, and it's alien in many ways. And I think for most people, it's natural to not want to enter alien environments. That's all.
But I mean, yeah, I totally get that. And to our earlier point, most professors are stay in your lane specialists. I get all that. But take, for example, let's draw an analogy with Elon Musk. I've written or maybe done a Saad Truth clip where I said that of all the wonderful, great entrepreneurial things that Elon Musk has done, none of them will, historically speaking, be as important as, whether you like him or not, as his defense of freedom of speech. So all the other stuff is going to matter a lot less than that. So now let's analogize to academics. academics, as you said, are very willing to have these debates within their small little esoteric ecosystems, but then on issues that are profoundly more important, frankly. So having these idea pathogens spreading across every single nook and cranny, whereby they're attacking our edifices of reason, where they're attacking whether men can menstruate or not, that's a lot more serious of an issue to debate. So I lament the fact that otherwise intelligent, bright, trained people don't go into these new ecosystems, because that's where we want our intellectual Navy SEALs to be weighing in, but they're not Navy SEAls because they're cowardly.
Yeah, but yeah, I can see that. I can see that. I think though that what happens is that people are more willing. Are more willing to dismiss something, and therefore dismiss sort of the idea of freedom of speech, the less they know about it.
Right.
And so when you're an expert in an area, you're open to almost any kind of discussion. The less you know, the more foreign it seems, the more willing you are naturally to dismiss it. And I think, I remember my institute that I ran, ran a whole meeting on the origins of xenophobia, and in groups versus out groups. And I think it's an innate human. It's more, we talked about, the immune system is a good example of kind of biological xenophobia, and it's useful. It's been extremely useful in an evolutionary sense, but maybe it's an evolutionary maladaptation because foreign things are suspicious and more easily dispensed with, and it's and then when you don't know anything, it's easy to say, biology doesn't say there's two sexes, or men are not different than women, or vice versa, and so I think what you're saying is right, but I think it's a natural predilection of academics who are experts in an area to have open minds in that area and closed minds in others. I think it's just a human property.
Yeah, no, I get you.
The hope of science is that if it can train you to be open your mind in one area, the hope is that legacy will train your mind to be open in another area. But one of the big secrets about scientists that we should reveal is that scientists are human beings, and they suffer from the same.
I think Paul Meehl, the famous psychologist, in one of his autobiographical excerpts said, ethology rules academia, meaning that academics are no different than all of the other primates in terms of territoriality and so on. So we're just smart primates. Okay,
what? The only and another person who's overrated, in my opinion, besides Donald Rumsfeld, is Henry Kissinger. Another person who I learned to despise during the Vietnam War, but one of the things he said, which I learned wasn't his anyway, but I learned it from him, was that academic disputes are so vicious because the stakes are so small.
Yeah, I love that quote.
But it's not his. He adapted it. I learned it came from someone else, and I forget who.
Oh, is that right? Okay, because I usually ascribe it to him.
Sure, he made it popular.
Well, since we're talking about famous academics, and I know that you know him well, in all fairness, I'll begin by saying that I'm no fan of his. Can you give me in a couple of sentences what you love about Noam Chomsky?
I knew you were going to have to name Noam Chomsky. Well, Noam is one of the more remarkable people I've ever known, and I say that of some people I also disagree with profoundly, but Noam has an ability to frame questions in a way that few people can, and also an encyclopedic knowledge of things. He remembers things that he's read, and of course, besides the work in linguistics, which I'm aware of, but I don't appreciate as well as a linguist would, although I've tried to, because I've done dialogues with Noam and tried to talk to about various aspects of linguistics. But I remember when impressed me so much when I first, the great thing about being a student at MIT, or at least doing your PhD at MIT, was that there were no required courses. And I took very few. It turns out all the courses I took were ended up being at Harvard. But the one course I did take was a course that Noam taught in American foreign policy. And what amazed me was him boiling things down to simple questions, which, whether or not you agree with him, actually, there's the premise of where he comes from is something that I think you would agree with, which is this statement that the American foreign policy is any different than the foreign policy of any other country is suspect. One would suspect that the foreign policy of any country is governed by the self-interest not only of the country, but the self-interest of those people who are running the country. And that and if you make that presumption, your view of American foreign policy is very different than the myth that we all grew up with that somehow it's, where it's altruistic, it's meant to make the world free and everything else. And we used to tell me two things, and one of them you'll love, one of them you might not love. One of them was that if you want to find out whether something you're hearing about in the press is reasonable, ask a 4-year-old and say, does this sound reasonable? And but the other one he told me, which is if you really want to find out what's going on in the world, read the business journals.
Yes.
Because you see, you can read all this nonsense in the newspapers, but in business, you have to know how the world really works if you want to make money. And so if you read the business journals, they don't cut around with all this, nice crap. They'll tell you how it really is. And I think so. But I guess I was just so impressed with his ability as a scientist, but also to have such an encyclopedic knowledge, and two other things, the courage, especially during the Vietnam War, the courage to speak out at a time when it makes you not only unpopular, but canceled.
Right.
And the second part, and I learned again as a student, the reason I admired him as a human being and I tried to emulate is, first of all, being able to say things that get you, that you are true, even regardless of what the consequences are. The second thing was, I remember when I went to talks before I knew him, really, and he would give a talk, and then he would spend, didn't matter if it was 3 or 4 hours afterwards, answering every single question of everyone, not just en masse, but the shy people who came up afterwards. And I just thought that was such a wonderful thing to do. Nice. And he didn't leave until there were no more questions. So I guess as a human being, I find him so impressive. Now, I don't agree with everything he says. But I also think, like many people who speak out, he's often misinterpreted. Some people think of him as an enemy of Israel, and he was studied in Israel. He's Jewish, background, and I don't think he's an enemy of Israel. I think he's concerned about things that many people are concerned about now in Israel, maybe not as much. So I think he tends to get misrepresented a lot, but he's also, like some people, he tends to be dogmatic, and things that he believes, and I think, I'm not sure I agree with all of them. So anyway, that's my
fair enough. That was a diplomatic
my moment of honoring Noam Chomsky, who I'm happy to honor. And by the way, interestingly enough, what I'm really thrilled about is that this may be actually, I think this is the first interview, although it hasn't been about the book much, and I don't care. I'm not here to sell books, but although this is kind of the first interview that's about the book, one of the first public sessions will be in England, but done remotely at a thing called the How To Academy. It's going to be a dialogue, and my interlocutor will be Noam Chomsky. So it'll be interesting.
Oh, I look forward to seeing that. Okay, last two questions, although of course I could keep you here for another 5 hours. So this is a question that's become sort of a standard part of our ending my chats. I ask people, because in one of the last chapters of my forthcoming book, I talk about, if you could live your life without looking back with few regrets, you win, basically. And so I want to set up that question for you with the following intro. One of my PhD professors at Cornell is someone named Tom Gilovich, who pioneered the study of psychology of regret. And he basically distinguished between two forms of regret due to action versus regret due to inaction. Regret due to action, I regret that I cheated on my wife, and now my marriage is dead. I regret that I did that. Regret due to inaction, I really should have gone into physics. I decided to become a physician, but really my love was physics. I should have gone. So now it turns out that over the long term, most of us, the regrets that loom largest in our minds and hearts are regrets due to inaction. So with that said, you're still a relatively young man with many years hopefully left in you. If you look back at your life, would you be willing to share what would be your 1 or 2 greatest regrets? And let's see if they fit with the theory by Thomas Gilovich.
I try not to think it. You're going to force me to go to play, because I always try to look forward rather than backwards. So
I regret that I never asked that woman to marry me. I
No,
regret
I'll
that I
tell you,
didn't go
I
to
regret, I
sociology.
regret that I never forced that stupid junior faculty member to shut up, and I could have had a last conversation with Richard Feynman. That's something I know I regret.
If that's your biggest regret, you've lived a very good and privileged life, Lawrence.
No, I may probably have. I'm not sure it's a good, but probably privileged. But I I think you never know what would have happened. So I guess I don't find it. I guess I don't find it productive. It's really weird. Maybe it's a character flaw. There are things I wish I'd done, and there are things I've done that I wish I hadn't done. Reporters that I wish I hadn't talked to, and because I thought they were idiots, and then it comes back to bite you in the butt. But I guess I know I'm going to disappoint you. I don't know what my greatest contributions to humanity are or will be, and I don't think it's up to me to say. And I just think there's a lot of things I could have regrets over, and some of them may have had a much more profound influence on my life than others. But the life I live is the life I live it, and I think so. I don't know if someone once said having regrets is like being punished twice, but but yeah, there are lots of things I regret, but I try and get over them really quickly. And I'm sorry. I wish I could give you. I'm sure it's a regret of inaction.
Yeah.
Rather than action. I mean, I can tell you the actions I've made that have had severe consequences, but I'm pretty certain it's the things, that I didn't do, and some of them I try and overcome. One of my big regrets is I never wrote that history book. So I'm gonna
Well, what you're going to do now.
yeah.
Yeah, but you mentioned it's not for you to say what would be your biggest contribution. So allow me to do that for you. I think that probably popularizing science to many, many people is arguably both of our greatest legacies. Yes, we might have written specific papers that had an impact and were cited 400 times in the journals, and that's great. And I'm not in any way being derogatory to that, because that's part of academia, that's part of science. You have to publish in peer-reviewed journals. But I think inspiring, right? When I appear on Joe Rogan and 20 million people download it or whatever, watch it, and then they write to me and they say, I went and studied evolutionary psychology or psychology of decision making or consumer psychology precisely because I was so inspired seeing you on Joe Rogan, and I receive a million of those. That probably, if there was a way to quantify our respective influences, if I can speak for both of us, that's probably our biggest contribution. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't do biggest, so I'm not. I think it's an important contribution. I don't know whether the science contributions I make in the long run will impact in the field the most. What is satisfying? It is incredibly satisfying to me, and I am old enough. I'm not young. I'm going to be turning 70 next year.
Wow, you look young.
I know I look young, but I'm older than I look. And so I have for many years now have had the situation where I meet not just young people, I meet scientists who say what you wrote or what you said, made me want to be a scientist, and it's very satisfying, and because and that's one of the reasons why I write. I've said this a lot. I'm returning the favor. I became a scientist because I read people like Feynman and Isaac Asimov and Albert Einstein and George Gamow and other people, and I'm returning the favor by doing that. So yeah, it's certainly. I think it's worthwhile, or I wouldn't be doing it.
Right.
But I, and it's very flattering, to be on some major TV program or be whatever, and get a lot of attention and feedback and impact because of that, or write a best-selling book or whatever. But again, maybe because I also studied history, I like to think I don't have the historical perspective to be able to judge. So it'll be for someone else to do, and I won't really care. Because
you'll be gone. You'll be in another dimension.
Well, not another dimension, but then I'll talk. Then I'll say what my friend, and I'm happy to say is my friend Woody Allen would say, which is I don't want to live on forever. I want to live on I don't want to live on forever in your hearts. I want to live on forever in my apartment. He would say, but I wouldn't want to be in his apartment. But those things I try not to. Yeah, we're all influenced. We all have vanity and all the rest of the stuff. But
Sure.
But I try to both think forward and try to not presume which of the things I'm doing is most significant. And that's what we said, going back to the beginning of our discussion. That's one of the reasons why I do many things, because I'm convinced I don't know in the end what's going to be most useful.
Okay, last question. Notwithstanding that your main focus is to now promote the Edge of Knowledge, and people go out, purchase it. May 9th, it drops. Do it. Put up your book, Lawrence, so
There
that
we
they
go.
can
Here
see
it
it.
is.
There it is.
Actually, I do think that I will say one. I'm very pleased with this book, and I think if you ask me what's the sort of best successor to the say Universe from Nothing, which was a influential and best-selling book, I do think this is it, because it takes us in the next. So I feel that way about this book, but I have no presumptions about how it's going to do.
So other than this book, which you'll be busy promoting over the next few months, are there any projects that you would like to share with us at this moment? Future projects?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I don't know how much promotion I'm going to do. And you know, by the way, one of the things I really admire about Woody Allen, which he taught me, is when he finishes a movie, he not only never sees it again, he doesn't talk about it again. You know, he doesn't want to talk about it. He's never. First time I met him, I told him, you know, I was flying back from Australia, and I'd seen Annie Hall on the plane again, which was a movie that had a huge influence on me. And he said, I've never seen it after I made it. By the time the movie appears, I'm working on the next project.
Right.
That idea of looking forward is something I admire tremendously. I don't have his kind of discipline, but I try and emulate it. But besides, you know, the book is done, so yeah, I'll talk about it, and it'll be exciting. But I'm obviously thinking about other things, including some of the writing I'm doing besides the new book that's coming out, and some physics problems that are always in the back of my mind. But I'm excited about the thinking about what we could do. One of the terrifying things to do for an academic is to leave academia, and when I retired, I did something I wanted to do for a long time, which is create a foundation. It's a nonprofit foundation to try and do the things that I thought was important, to mix science and culture together. And it's a challenge to run a foundation, especially a nonprofit, and so to try and think of ways that can have a positive impact is something that I'm spending a lot of time on. And the podcasts I do is part of that. It's just one of the many things, and I depend on. Right now, it's all volunteers, because we don't, the money you raise, you can't pay people to do something. The other thing I will promote, not shamelessly, because is that I'm working very hard to save a family who was in Afghanistan.
Oh, wow.
We moved them to Pakistan with 5 young girls whose lives would be over.
Oh, my God.
And to save a single family may just be like a drop in the bucket. But to me, I was pleased that previously I've done that with a young woman from Afghanistan who'd read my stuff and wasn't allowed to go to school, and I managed to get her to help, not just myself but other people, get her to the United States, get my university to give her a scholarship, and now she's studying physics. But that was very satisfying, and to help one person, especially for someone like me whose work is very ephemeral, is really among the most satisfying things I can do.
Wow, that's wonderful. What a nice way to end. Hey, Lawrence, what a delight to chat with you. Please come back anytime. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline. Okay, and sure. I will tag you on Twitter once the chat is up, which is hopefully later today. Thank you so much for coming on. Real delight.
It's been a real pleasure for me too, guys.
Cheers. Thank you, Lawrence.